I heard my name coming out of a woman's voice behind me. I turned. Framed by racks of croissants, pastries, and muffins was Vera, her body hugged by a floor-length camel-colored coat. It fit perfectly with the vibe of this area, and so did she. She was attractive, very, like a more mature Cameron Diaz. The tall, trim physique, then the moderately wide face with cheeks like warm apples, the smile that spread the face open even wider, the eyes of clear, gentle blue framed by short, dark blonde hair. It was in that moment that I, for the first time, consciously realized how similar some aspects of Vera's face were to my own. Is that why, despite how different we can be, I felt so magnetized to her when I first saw her 2 years ago? Minutes later, seated at our usual table, adjacent to the cold, frosted floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto 33rd Street, Vera dumped roughly a third of the table's honey-filled plastic bear into her mug of tea. Have you thought about the financial amends you need to make to your parents? Well, I mean, not in the last 2 weeks, but I mean, I have the draft. I remember you wanted to send it out before spring started. That's, she looked at her watch. In 2 days, let's go over it. We then did a little reading out of the big book. Half an hour later, we closed our books. She polished off her second cup of tea. She sat back in her chair and sighed. Good work. Unless there's anything else. Her stately kindness and generosity pushed a needle even deeper into my side. She loved me. I loved her. I wanted to tell her that I decided several weeks ago to begin a period of abstinence. I wanted to tell her that it had ended just earlier this week with the same person who motivated me to begin it. I wanted to tell her how, even though I didn't achieve 90 days with my celibacy, I recently noticed a change in the reflection of my bathroom mirror. But I was terrified of being judged by Vera over my behavior around intimacy. In fact, it often felt like there was a third presence in our presence. It felt as though there was me, there was her, and there was a third spirit, the unholy ghost, that represented my fear and anger towards her, towards the possibility of being judged for something that I felt entitled to enjoy after years and years of repression. We'd had a landmark conversation about this very subject a year ago. It had caused her to open up to me in a way I'd never experienced, and it helped me understand why she came across as so unaccepting on those rare occasions I told her I hadn't used protection. It helped me understand how the absence of condoms had irrevocably darkened her life. She'd become pregnant in her 20s. She'd had an abortion in the second trimester. She faulted her hazy, substance-altered mind for her unawareness of her own body. The experience had gutted her, not just physically, enough to make her change her habits for years afterwards. Eventually, though, she'd found herself pregnant again. Vera had noticed her pregnancy much earlier this time and might have been able to terminate it while avoiding the same sense of guilt and shame. But the first experience had scarred her so badly that she felt obligated to carry the baby to term. She could almost immediately tell that the biological father was not going to be in the picture in the long term. Regarding the baby's father, she hadn't provided me with more details than that vague statement. Faced with the prospect of raising the child alone, she figured she probably should place the child for adoption. When her next-door neighbor, a beautiful, complicated man named Clark, discovered what was going on, he was earnest to help her raise the child. Incidentally, Clark was already an ardent fan of the freshly burgeoning Material Girl. Clark was Vera's age and good to her. He had even introduced her to a friend of his who had remained a good friend of hers to this day, Topeka. Back then, Vera knew about herself that she had some serious problems lurking in her background. She also knew how flawed Clark was, but Clark's eagerness to become a parent had been enough to convince her she might be able to keep the baby. Vera believed both she and Clark were capable of love, and that if they worked as a team, they could probably give the upcoming child a decent start in life. So it was settled. They would be parents. This time, her second trimester, in the fall of 1985, had been full of hope and joy. And then, when Vera was in her third trimester, Clark, who'd never been tested for HIV, suddenly got very sick. The night Vera delivered her baby was the night Clark was taken off of life support at a different hospital. Topeka, who I knew today as Vera's eccentric and fabulous friend who lived on Fire Island, had been with Clark that last night. Reading between the lines, I ascertained that Vera had never been able to truly forgive herself from running away from Clark. She'd run away because she'd already witnessed what awaited him, and it was highly traumatic watching a young man you loved rot to death, unable to do anything to save him. So she had cut Clark off. She gave birth with no attending family or friends one night early in 1986. She'd put the baby up for adoption. Days later, shut inside her apartment with her head painfully full of shame and her breasts painfully full of milk, Vera had suddenly begun to hear the retch and wipe and screech of professional boxing tape being unrolled and cut off down the hall from her apartment. It was Clark's parents, and who knows who else, boxing up his entire home, his entire life with breathtaking efficiency. Trembling, Vera had rushed to turn on music or the TV and then cowered in the furthest corner of her flat, numbing her agony with alcohol. Several months passed. She'd been returning home one June afternoon when she saw a package left outside Clark's former apartment. It was addressed to him. Someone else lived there now, of course, but they must not have found the package yet. The package was very thin, a box. It was the size of a vinyl record. She'd taken it, opened it, pulled off the bubble wrap protection inside. It was a vinyl album Clark must have pre-ordered before he died. It was the third album from his favorite singer. On its cover, an elegant, softly blue-tinted image of an artificially blonde woman tilting her head up to the sky, her eyes closed. The image conjured the grace and majesty of a swan, while also gleaming of an almost viscerally dangerous poise like that of a cobra coiling to strike. Vera had shoved the album somewhere in her apartment where she wouldn't see it. And that's where it had stayed from 1986 until 2010. That's when she came into recovery. It was at that point that she pulled the blue-tinted record cover out of the darkness. Its elegant, subtle fade was not so subtle anymore. She framed it. She posted it on the wall in her apartment that would receive the most sunshine. Clark would finally feel some warmth on his face.